Okay, so today we're going to talk about turfgrass origins. Where do turfgrasses originate in the world? And we're going to use terms like native, naturalized, and talk about some of the other terms, alien, exotic, invasive. And it's important that we have a note of caution, because the way in which we use these words, while in class or in a discussion with your friends, is not all that important. When you're talking about regulatory bodies, lawmakers, folks that have an issue with a particular plant, these words carry actual meaning and power and have the ability to stop something from happening or to prevent something from being developed. So it's important that we understand these terms and understand where turfgrasses come from. So native, in this sense, when we use the term native or we talk about a native grass, we're talking about a grass, according to Webster, that is indigenous to a particular locality. And indigenous means from that locality, developed wholly or within that locality. However, one of the problems in classifying plants as native is that we really have some fairly limited information about where plants come from. We'll talk about some of the things that we have evidence for. But the problem is that if we classify a plant and we do it in a way that's based on an arbitrary time frame, then we create some real barriers to moving plants that might not really need to exist. For example, if we say that we don't think a particular grass should be here because it's not native, and we define native based on a particular time, then we end up with erroneous results, faulty perceptions about what is native and what isn't native. And that's an important issue when we talk about regulatory and lawmaking powers. So there's one perception that many people have with respect to native species when we talk about plants, and importantly turfgrasses, and that is that plant species that were here, and by here I mean in the North American area or anywhere else in the world if that's where you're talking about, that plant species that were here when the Europeans arrived are native. And I put native in quotes because it's important to realize that that time frame is purely arbitrary. Because there's evidence in the fossil record as well as in records of archaeological digs and anthropological studies of early American populations, groups like the mound builders, that almost certainly moved plant materials around from location to location and were well traveled both within the North American continent as well as between continents. This occurred in the late Holocene, right, somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 years ago. And plants were moved long before that as well. So it stands to reason that when we talk about the last 400 or 500 years, that really we need to have a fuller picture of the geological time frame that we're talking about over the course of thousands or even millions of years in terms of how plants moved around. And so when we talk about something being native or not native, and we use this arbitrary time frame of when Europeans arrived as being native or not native, that's really an arbitrary position to take based on political and sometimes expedient considerations. When we look at early 1900s, in the early 1900s texts talk about particular genera, particularly Agrostis, Festuca, and Poa, and we'll talk about what those genera are later. But just take it for now that these are genera of turfgrasses, that Agrostis, Festuca, and Poa, and there's three really important genera, were classified as native, that they were existing here and locally as a native plant. And it's not hard to believe that when you think about how things might have moved around the land areas over the course of geological time. So perhaps it's better to think about, rather than native species, what we might call naturalized species, or in other words, those that are well adapted and persist without direct human input, because that's a better working definition for what we're talking about when we think about species that are able to maintain themselves, that don't require a lot of babysitting by humans. In other words, a naturalized species would be something that could grow in the environment without a whole lot of human input. In our area here in Knoxville, Tennessee, if I brought a banana plant here, I would have to do a lot of extra work to keep that alive. So in other words, it's not going to ever be a naturalized species. So when we think about that, we want to make sure that naturalized is something that we think about as being adapted and well suited to an area, rather than native, which again depends on your time frame and your specifics. And it's very easy to sit back and think about, from a geological time frame perspective, how these grasses probably moved around. And so it's important that we don't make that mistake when we think about these terms. So when we think about geological time frames, we have to think about what was happening during those time frames, because we start thinking about, Europeans arriving in North America. That's 450 years ago now. If we think about the early Native American populations, we're talking about something as old as 4,000 or 5,000 years old. So there's a time frame there. And then we start going back millions of years. So it's important that we think about what was happening and how the world was developing. And if you recall from some of your early science courses in high school and even grade school, and then maybe some classes in college, the continents move about the Earth in the crust using the theory of plate tectonics. And it's believed that Pangaea was a kind of a supercontinent that existed about 500 million years ago. So all the plant materials that were present were on one place on the planet, on one continent. So they were able to move around. And then as those continents began to drift apart and split apart, we get two continents, Laurasia and Gondwana. Laurasia is a continent that is made up of what is today North America and Eurasia, and Gondwana had South America, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia. So we have Asia and Europe and North America, so 3 of the 7 in Laurasia and 4 of the 7 in Gondwana. And this takes place around 160 million years ago. Now, all during this time, there are land bridges and then small oceanic distances that allowed for animals and other peoples and hominids to move materials around. And it's quite likely that they did move around. Dispersal patterns and development of ways of seeds being transmitted either through a gut of an animal or carried on their fur or coat. These are strategies that have been around since time immemorial, since these times, 100 million years ago, 500 million years ago. So these land bridges and small oceanic distances made that migration possible. For example, as Africa and South America were splitting apart to form a new continent after Gondwana, the distance that scientists believe started limiting movement was when the oceanic distance became about 745 miles. So that's not a long that's a pretty long way. But when you think about an ocean today, that's not that big of an ocean. So it almost certainly was possible for plant materials to move from one continent to the next. And in fact, the fossil record supports that to some extent. When we think about ancestral animals that might have moved plants, we think about the birds and bovine species that both were around at that time. So birds were able to ingest seeds and then move them great distances. And then bovine species, early bovines with their stomachs and their grazing habits, also almost certainly moved plant material around by eating seeds and materials and then moving and migrating to a different location, and then through excreting those seeds then establishing those plants in different areas. This evidence is based on the fossil record. The challenge with really getting a good story together for how grasses moved around these areas, these continents, is difficult because grasses don't make good fossil specimens. However, there is evidence from coprolites, which are excrement from animals that have been fossilized, and other things, that some of this material was present and was moving around the planet on geological timescales of millions of years ago. So it's important to recognize when we think about native species that we don't assign it an arbitrary time frame, that we consider what's happened over the course of time on a geological perspective, just as we do with all the other things that we think about with regards to how the world developed and how plants got to be where they were and how animals evolved to be what they are today.